Well, I think this is really a challenge, and luckily there was a small group which helped John and Daniel and me to become more specific. And this was this preparatory group. So we had dinner and breakfast today, and we tried to talk about the specific challenges of this community, clashes between what's happening at the European scale in terms of concepts and terminology. And I think one of the key matters was this trade-off between what scientists want to do at their sites, what they want to do in their zone ateliers, and what makes the added value of a country and a continental scale network. And also I was asked to give some information relevant for tomorrow's group work. In very brief, and we decided we would have 5 standard slides you can look up in the document, the background information document, which I want to congratulate Jerome and Isabel for. I think this is a perfect compilation of material, and I'd be happy if all the countries would have something like that in the language of the country, if it's not English. In very brief, we have a long-lasting process that started actually in the 90s of the last century, and along this line, and in terms of talking about research infrastructures, the process started around 2010. There was a range of projects with 2 current projects, the PPP and the PLUS, working towards the RI, and specifically the PLUS interfacing with the research communities as those driving the infrastructure development, ideally. And I think that these numbers tell you the story in terms of complexity and the challenge of duly involving and being transparent with so many internal and external stakeholders. That's the one reference slide, and I'm using it for the purpose to introduce everything I'm saying with respect to tomorrow's workshops, where, of course, we have to understand that there are central services. We don't know how these central services will be organized yet. There will be a portal through which you access any kind of service the RI will provide. There will be a legal entity where the boundaries are also not clear. And the key question, for example, is, I'm getting to the site network later, we will have topic centers, and the topic centers will in total cover aspects and provide services in these 6 areas. I won't read them, you can briefly run through them. I think titles are self-explanatory, and we don't know yet how the total of services in these thematic areas would finally be mirrored in the structure of the topic centers. So it might, in any case, it's not a one-to-one translation. That's not intended, but we had to structure the kind of services somehow. So there will be topic centers. We don't know who will operate them, how many there will be, if they will be shared by countries, if even single institutions will run them. And then on the bottom, the actual backbone of eLTER in terms of the sites and the LTSCR platforms. A brief glance at the coverage. I won't spend much time on that, only a remark. It's a dynamic picture, and against our own expectation, even in COVID times, we had 2 more countries joining the process politically, and there is interest by others to jump on the train. And ESFRI has been one of the key incentives, because people have understood ESFRI is money, money is research, and site equipment in the end. And the one reference slide I want to show with a focus on actually this nature of the infrastructure, or the concept to enable buy-in. And you could argue, for example, if the social and economic sphere should be sitting on top of each other and all this kind of stuff, but the key message, we hope, is still clear. We want to make researchers from all kinds of disciplines collaborate on well-chosen sites. The sites will have a hierarchy in terms of a typology of sites from better equipped, more expensive to less expensive, and a key element of the services will be that, and that's beyond the actual idea of the eLTER research infrastructure, we will not only have the data from the variables we observe ourselves, but we will integrate this information with information from various other sources, including remote sensing, data-based information, modeling outcomes, etc., to provide seamless access to the disciplinary science, seamless access to data where this individual scientist would not have the resources or the knowledge to access this data by himself or through a single project or through the capacity of a single site research team. A glance at the hierarchy of categories. The platforms have survived, and there was a long discussion of how many sites should be in a platform, should there be at all the sites in the platform. Most of you have seen the recent concept, and we are now in the phase when the countries have to decide what assemblage do I want for my country, what do I want to contribute to the research infrastructure. As said, the categories represent various levels of spatial complexity, instrumentation, and costs. And this brings us to one of the hottest issues in the dialogue, the standard observations. And now I start referring to yesterday's discussion, looking at the guiding principles. So what remains in a way is that we want to know about the status and the development of the system, any kind of system, and sociology and economy are one of the pillars here in terms of information. And the guiding principles are that, of course, we want to have indicators sensitive to system change. And what's underlined is actually an item which I took the liberty to insert without having talked to the mastermind, Steffen Zacharias from UFZ. But it's an outcome of yesterday's discussion. The question is, could having variables information to support site comparison and clustering of sites for representativity checks and upscaling? So that means that whatever you do, whatever study on transformation, for example, you do, what are the variables that would be very likely to be needed and relevant across any kind of these studies on transformation? The hypothesis being that these basic variables would also be those to compare your region with other regions, to cluster sites suited for tackling certain questions, and to enable proper upscaling, to be able to say, with these clusters of platforms, of regions, of sites, we cover these and those strata at the European scale, so we can, in terms of mechanisms, actually give information, not with a full aerial coverage, but still from a mechanistic understanding, not only of the biogeophysical system, but also the sociological system, the socio-ecological system. The other elements here remain the same. The user groups, and this is related to tomorrow's workshop. When we develop services, we need to know who the users are, and this is just a reminder what you can look up in much more detail in the paper by Isabel and Sharon. We have these 4 communication target groups. These are decision makers, scientific community, peer, sister, brother, horizon networks, and general public, business and industry. And what you see in here as these leaves are our main stakeholder categories comprising internal stakeholders. There is a big landscape of other elements behind. There is a background picture which you don't see, I don't know for what reasons. So we have 31 stakeholder groups that were explicitly considered in collating workflows that these user groups think should be supported by the eLTER. And that's the last slide on on the relevance and the last reference slide. This is the feedback we got from the ministry people. We asked them, what's your one-word impression of eLTER? And please have a look. And what I want to say is this is not clapping our shoulders, that's only to say this is the perception of the ministerial delegations to whom we present the concept and the entire endeavor. What this actually, I think, conveys, there is a door open. I don't want to say more, but there is a door open for us to make the next step and say, well, that's the concepts, that's what we concretely want, and that's what we want to get funded concretely in the end of the story. And now entering, or like building the bridge to yesterday's discussion. It was a 2 hours discussion in a nice restaurant. Many of you will remember these two main components in what we call the whole systems approach for in situ research on life supported systems. So that's the horizontal component, which is in principle about the interaction between society and usage of natural resources. And we have a vertical component based on macrosystems ecology that says all these kind of interactions, feedback mechanisms happen within a scale and across scales. Of course, and I think many of you wouldn't like this Mickey Mouse picture here. There is a conceptual model behind. There are more conceptual models behind. And this is the one we have been using for this interaction at the horizontal level between the societal, the social template, and the biogeophysical template. And from a workshop together with the critical zone community, we agreed that there is actually no conceptual clash in our infrastructure between the notions of the biosphere or the ecosystems, and this is these are kind of the reference textbooks we refer to in saying you can have endless academic discussions, but in principle, at least in our understanding, we talk about the same things. And then if you tilt actually the horizontal layer and keep the green layer, the vertical layer upright, you get to the conceptual model. And then this brings me to many of Olivier's statements. So we have the strength of the sites, we have the strength of the platforms, of the zone ateliers, and there is a trend-scale approach where actually our hypothesis is that with a well-composed network, with well-chosen elements, we can achieve something at the continental scale, which is an add-on to the actual total of what we can achieve at a single platform, without the platforms and the sites being interoperable, well-organized, and capable of talking to each other along certain lines of information. And I'd dare to say that these lines of information are pretty close to what we call standard observations. So what's the common information we have to have beyond the site-specific characteristics and information? And that's the entry point for 2 slides when I tried to kind of structure all kinds of arguments from yesterday's discussion in a line of questions and statements. And maybe we have to look through it more than one time. So I understood the key question, and many of us have this background deeply rooted in a site, in a region, interacting with the actors, the decision makers. So how does my system work? And I only put socio-ecological in here because my understanding in the following use of the term system is both, like societal and biogeophysical template. The question is, what is for my question and system the appropriate customized experimental observational design? And that's my use of the term customized. To what extent do I have to consider the specificities of my system in my design? And as an important aspect, I understood yesterday that transdisciplinarity largely coincides with what you call co-creation of knowledge. That's what you do. But the next question from an RI or overarching perspective is, what are the characteristics that make my system unique? So what are the core system-specific science questions? And then the next one, where does my system compare to others? And this brings us to this third point here. What are the fingerprint characteristics to compare with others, to find clusters of systems, to collaborate on certain matters, and to judge representativity at the European scale? And one effort was, for example, done by John Dick et al., I think it was 2014, when they tried to cluster the European platforms and sites alongside their ecosystem service composition profile. So they said, this site is actually providing this and that ecosystem service, and can we observe similar patterns across platforms and sites, and thereby cluster sites that could collaborate on certain research questions. This is my system. And then beyond the system. From an overarching perspective, the question is, what are the overall gradients our systems cover at the European scale? And what are the potential messages to European decision making? And that means general recommendations, and I think we are rich of general recommendations. But the question is, to what extent is system diversity considered, or considered at all? And why am I saying that? I think most of you will not have read the Green Deal papers of the European Commission, but I stumbled over a very important, I think in the area 8 or chapter 8, there is the mentioning of that we have to consider fairness aspects in transformation, because otherwise it will not be sustainable, not be accepted. So I think that the key strength of eLTER is to say, well, we have the general trends, we can compare our sites, but that's the gradient of acceptability, the gradient of the potential to implement any of the mitigation measures across the socio-ecological systems. And I think if we come up with a semi-quantitative understanding of to what extent our network represents the European picture, that would be a major step forward. Because we actually pull this policy advice out of the general to the specific, and maybe can then point at the most critical aspects, including gradients across countries and biogeographical zones. Yeah, and then the third bit of my presentation or slide collection is how can we now benefit from this door I indicated or try to indicate is now open. They are ready to pay despite all the financial constraints, some infrastructure that provides services. It's a huge task, but how can we forge if we agree across Europe on this approach, this understanding into elements of the eLTER. So third bit. The first part is still part of the conceptual response of eLTER to the dilemma site versus the network and the needed specificity as opposed to what's generally applicable, for example, as being a mandatory criteria. And maybe some of the socio-ecologists have overread in the documents that we have this distinction between mandatory criteria and customizable characteristics. Again, it's about these vectors connecting sites, making sites comparable. Of course, mandatory criteria have to be transparent and quantifiable. They have to be crucial for site platform analysis, clustering, and upscaling, simple to control. And of course, we have to be able to put the price tag on these components. But we, without the discussion actually yesterday, had always this way out of the dilemma of what we called customizable characteristics. And from the discussion, I understood the term is really difficult to cope with. What's customizable characteristic? It's actually that within certain limits, where no general rule is scientifically or technically possible, we would have characteristics and activities that are done at the site, well justified, without being a general recipe. And then people said, well, then everyone can do everything and nothing. And we said, well, in science, you have a strong tool. It's the scientific review. So this is the component where what you do in the site or the platform have to be fit for the purpose of tackling your site-specific questions. You have to write it down, you have to justify, and then it's going to be reviewed. And the customizable characteristics will, just like the mandatory criteria, be part of the labeling process. So that's all part of a procedure of suggesting, justifying, getting accepted, getting the stamp, and that means getting the funding in the end. And this brings me to tomorrow's workshop. We had this list of thematic service areas, and I'm not hiring, underpinning, we are not suggesting this will be the 6 topic centers. Please. And the question now is, how many? What's the scope of each in terms of topic centers, and which teams and institutions / countries? And Olivier asked me to give examples. So what's a topic center? What can a topic center be? So I went into ICOS, Archives and Material, and Actris. And you know, ICOS, Integrated Carbon Observation System. And I don't want to explain the structure, I just want to say there is a topic center, you don't even know to name. It's one topic center in a complete structure. And that's what it is. And if you look at it carefully, that's a bunch of people. I'm just saying a topic center can be a small thing, can be very targeted, and in this case what the guys are doing, they get the calibration gases from the global calibration gap in Boulder, Colorado, they transport to Karlsruhe, and they are producing the calibration gases for all ICO stations in Europe. Job done, topic center, very clear service, costs, budget, cash flow. Second example is a nightmare example, and I don't know how they want to administer that. This is one topic center, believe it or not. That's an example from Actris, and it's the Center for Aerosol Remote Sensing. And you see extremely complicated structures with many countries, many institutions, a tremendous budget, and I assume a lot of governance issues involved. The issue is, please have fantasy. We get what we properly argue and justify. And the only direction I think John and team, John Watkins is working on the service portfolio, we can give is, it has to be pragmatic and it should work. And maybe the core of it, it has to be a win-win. Anyone running a topic center is well advised to have an intrinsic interest to do it and to clearly see an advantage to do it in a European context. And I think that, for example, this selling the socio-ecological diversity of Europe to the decision makers through proper analysis and through digesting the information from the various socio-ecological systems, in my fantasy, that would be a high impact, relevant and super interesting topic center or a service. I'm talking services, not topic center. Okay, very brief, I'm finishing. We had a long process, complex process to digest 31 user group ideas of what we could do and support into a cluster of services. I just say that's a 1 year process of collecting possible demands across these groups, structuring them, clustering them, and deriving tools and components that we need to support the workflows. For example, a site registry. Having a clear understanding what's out there, what is it capable of, what data do we have, is one of the components and tools to bring it down to earth. 2 slides. The 11 services within a given service area. This is the workflow. So we have to clarify the service, like describe it, to get, if possible, in the specification process already an understanding who really needs it, and maybe collect some feedback from potential users, identify the tools you need to do it, cost, and identify how the topic center could actually achieve maximum delivery. And then I just want to show this slide. We have a recipe how you can describe the service. Like, for example, this European scale synthesis could be a service, and then you have to specify and if possible, expand on the needed resources and the cost range. And that's it. Open for questions. Thank you.